So belonging is the bedrock for high performance. So if you really want to win as a team, you really do need to know who you're running with, and they need to trust you, and you need to trust them, and you need to feel like your work matters, that it's being appreciated, and they need to feel the same. And fundamentally, it comes down to who's got your back.
Oh, wake up, rethink the status quo. When you get your money right, then you're the one who runs your life. Come build a wealthy spirit with Sammy and Michelle.
Today, Michelle and I are talking to Charlie Gilkey, who just launched his new book, Team Habits.
Sammy, I think this is going to be such an interesting conversation for our listeners because we were reading the book and we were thinking about all the different teams in our life. We have a podcast team. We go and do separate work. Sammy goes to her clinic. I have a lot of online communities that I'm in. And I really, really enjoy the way Charlie looks at teams as being a combination of our habits. I think there's a lot of really actionable tips that he has to fostering a better, more efficient team dynamic.
It's so true, Michelle. Teams are such a big part of our life, and our teams, literally and to some degree, they define our happiness. Because when you have a good team, when you feel connected to those people within your team, that just makes life so much more enjoyable. And I'm really happy we get to talk to Charlie today to find out strategies to help improve our teams. Let's get into it.
We are so excited to have author Charlie Gilkey on the podcast today. Sammy, I read so many self-development books last year, and the one I keep recommending to people is Start Finishing by Charlie. I'm not exaggerating when I say it changed the trajectory of my life by giving me the tools to start prioritizing and completing the projects that are important to me. Charlie has a new book coming out called Team Habits: How Small Actions Lead to Extraordinary Results, and it's out today. We read this book, and once again, Charlie does a great job of breaking down easy-to-implement frameworks that can help you improve the experience of being part of a team, whether that's at work or within your household. Charlie knows a lot about how a team works. Charlie is not only a former Army logistics officer, he's also advised hundreds of teams, from Fortune 100 companies to tiny nonprofits, through Productive Flourishing, the coaching and training company he founded. Thank you, Charlie, for joining us on Build a Wealthy Spirit.
Michelle, Sammy, thanks so much for having me. Listeners, in case you hear it in my voice, I'm actually on the tail end of recovering from COVID, so I might sniffle a little bit, might be a little bit congested, but don't worry, I'm here. I'm excited about this, and I really appreciate the time we have together today.
Charlie, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you are on the mend, and we really do appreciate you taking some time to speak with us today.
Yes. And I wanted to start off the interview with a question that I stole from you. What's a non-work win that you had this week?
I'll just keep with what I'm doing. I was tested positive for COVID after coming back from a Team Habits strategy retreat in Georgia, and that was Sunday. And so today we're recording on Friday, and y'all, just the way that I felt better every day, right, since taking the meds and doing this. And why that's such a non-work win is I know COVID has sucked for so many different reasons, but here I am, basically having a first world problem after having a pandemic disease that killed so many people and put so many people in the hospital. So I'm incredibly grateful for all the folks that have made vaccines possible, that have made medicine possible. Really grateful that Sunday I felt like really terrible. Like, I don't know if I'm going to make it. Today I'm on a podcast with two souls and we're having a great conversation. So that's my non-work win.
I love that. And I'm so happy you're feeling better. And it is really amazing, how far we've come since the beginning of COVID. So that's awesome that you've been able to go through that journey this week. Today, we are talking to Charlie about teams and team habits. And Michelle and I, we were talking about how almost in everything that we do, there's a team. Michelle and I, are a little household team, managing our home, managing our move. We're a podcast team. We both go to work and we have work teams. There are teams literally everywhere. And I think something we overlook is how we interact with those teams and how those teams move forward. A lot of the times we think about ourselves as individuals and our individual goals. But when we think about the team and the team's goals, that really helps foster an environment that we like to work in, and then also an environment where we can progress towards our goals as a collective and as an individual. And so that's why we've brought Charlie on, because we think this is such an important topic to really dive into and get some tips and get some helpers on how to make sure our teams work in an awesome way.
And Charlie, your book is called Team Habits. And so I wanted to open with, why is it important to form good habits within a team?
Well, because we are creatures of habit, I would like to take the question and say, look, we already have habits as a team, right? We already do things together. Just like as an individual, we have our own personal habits, and they can be good or bad. And so I want to shift sort of the question from why is it important to develop good habits, just to start like, we have team habits. Some of them are really serving us well, but many are not. And the thing about team habits specifically is that they are unconscious, a lot of times unconscious, implicit agreements with each other about how we do things. So we don't say that we do certain things like, Michelle, Sammy, I know you live together, so you probably had some conversations about where things go in the fridge. You've probably made some things conscious, but, as sisters who are now adults, there's probably a period of time where you actually had to sit down and say, actually, here's where we put the drinks. Here's where we put the meats. Here's where we put some of this. Otherwise, it's just willy-nilly all over the place, which works for some people, but not many. And so you sort of went from that team habit of disorganized, just throw it in there, doesn't matter, to you saying, okay, this is how we do things in here. So both of you can open the fridge door, and reach exactly where you're trying to do and be in the middle of a conversation and not open the door and be like, oh God, where is the thing that I'm looking for? And it's going to take 5 minutes. So it's important to develop good team habits because when we really look at the morale, satisfaction, and engagement that we have from our team, so much of it is determined by not our good habits, but actually our bad habits. So, if you've read The Progress Principle by Teresa Amabile, she pointed out that minor day-to-day setbacks, have more of a morale weight than big wins. So every time you get that CC thread from hell, or every time, someone doesn't actually share the file with the right permissions, right? All those types of things, those little things add up. And that becomes the tenor and tone of work. So if we just keep the good habits that we have, cultivate those, appreciate those, articulate those, but just work on some of those small things, what I call broken printers, right? And we might talk about that here in just a second. Then what we find is, 1, work is easier. 2, we're not strangely frustrated and pissed off at the people we otherwise actually really like. And 3, we get more of the outcomes and results that we want to have as individuals. And so, the reality is so much of business management literature has underneath it a core that people are somehow broken, or they need to be fixed, or they need to be optimized, and so on and so forth. And I take a actually inverted view of that and look at who we are as a species. As a species, we love getting stuff done. 2, we are cooperative by nature. We are a social cooperative species. 3, we are motivated to get stuff done. And 1 and 3 are not the same thing. They sound like it, but they're actually not. And so if you look at the baseline of who humans are, you see that we are actually wired to get stuff done together and to be in good relationships with each other. So if we're not doing that, something else is in the way. It's not the people that are broken. Something else is broken. And my point is, it's usually our team habits or our work ways.
I really think it's so important what you're saying there, Charlie, which one of the big things that you mentioned is that the habits exist whether or not we're conscientious of them, whether or not they're good habits or bad habits, they're there. And I think sometimes that's easy for us to recognize in ourselves, or that's even something that's in the lexicon now. Everybody's thinking about their habits. But before I read this book, I didn't really think that much about what our team habits look like. And it's so funny that when you start to weed through it with that lens, you start to see, there are certain habits our team has. There are certain habits that I have. With your example with the fridge, we've had a similar issue with our dishwasher, where Sammy and I both had habits, but we had different habits. And we had to sit down and have a conversation about it because it got to a point where we were getting frustrated that there we weren't on the same schedule. And so I really think that's so key. And what you realize when you start looking at your habits is, like you said, there are these broken printers. And so this is a metaphor in your book that I really, really enjoyed. Could you explain to us a little bit, like, what are broken printers?
Yeah, so it shows my age a little bit, but I think it's still true. Every organization that I've ever worked at or consulted with has had a broken printer, a literal broken printer that everybody knew about. Like, it's the one with the streak, or the one that's got the damn code that nobody can remember, or that uses the funky paper, or that's, sitting in the conference chair. Like, there's always a broken printer somewhere. And it's just like, oh yeah, it's there. Like, sometimes we name the damn thing, right? It's Alex sitting in the corner. Like, why? And what's interesting to me about that is when you look at the downstream cost of broken printers, that's where it starts to become important, because it's a printer. No one cares, except when it's time to give that big presentation. And the printer does what the printer always does, and people are rushed and scrambling and scattered when they show up to the presentation. And, the thing about it is, at the end of the day, switching out that printer is at most a $500 decision that someone can do in 30 minutes. And we don't. And yet, we will very quickly call a meeting that costs considerably more than that in both dollars and time to discuss trivialities and to give updates and things like that. So we have this fundamental mismatch between the things that we actually need to solve and can solve and the things we can't. Now, I use broken printer because it's a very tangible, concrete thing, and most people have experience with that. But it's not just about printers, right? Like I mentioned earlier, it can be the CC thread from hell that exists in so many workplaces. It could be channel bombing in Slack or Teams. It can be someone calls a meeting and then you figure out 15 minutes after the meeting started what the meeting was actually about. It's just bad team habits like that. Broken printers happen over and over again. And the beauty of this is that when you actually break it down into specific habits like that, you can change it. Right? So I'll talk about meeting culture real quick because it's a common sort of whipping boy in team spaces. Meetings suck and all those different things that we talk about that. And many people will come to me and say, Charlie, our meeting culture is broken and we need to fix it. And the first thing I'll say is, well, you don't fix your meeting culture. Culture is an amalgam of a lot of different habits that you do around meetings. So what we're going to do is take individual pieces of your meeting culture and change those. So, for instance, I just mentioned the show up to the meeting and figure out 15 minutes later why you're at the meeting. We can change that habit and just create a team rule that if there's no agenda, there's no meeting. Period. I'm not showing up unless someone tells me what the meeting is about and what I'm supposed to do there. And if you, as the meeting organizer, can't do that amount of work, including leaders, then you need to step back and really think about how you're using people's time, energy, and attention. Which means I should pause, because I've been using teams, and I mean something very specific, actually. Your team is the 4 to 8 people that you work with day in and day out. Most teams are about that big. Outside of that, it doesn't scale well. This is not your group. This is not your department. This is not necessarily your coworker. You might have a coworker that's actually not a teammate.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the 4 to 8 people, and that's super, super important, because with that group of 4 to 8 people, you actually have this very personal relationship with them. So for the rest of this podcast, I'm going to pretend that Sammy, Michelle, and I are on a team. Sammy and Michelle are already on a team, so I'm just adding myself. I'm the third wheel here, y'all. But I know Sammy. I know Michelle. I know their favorite songs. I know what food they like. I know what's going to trigger them. I know all those different things. And it doesn't have to scale. It's 4 to 8 people, right? That we're going to spend the next 6 months, 3 years, decade with. Fundamentally, when you think about that relationship, it becomes really obvious that if Sammy, Michelle, and I don't like the way our meetings work, we can just say, hey, I'll pretend it's me. I can say, hey, Sammy, Michelle, I don't know that what we're doing is really working for us. Is it working for you? And they may be like, no, it's terrible. And it's like, well, let's do something different, right? Let's just try something a little bit different. We don't need the big bosses. We don't need a budget. We just need to show up and take care of each other and be honest. And if we do that, we can solve a lot of these minor annoyances and fix these broken printers today where we are.
It's so true, Charlie. And I love that you define teams, because I think that when it comes to teams, for example, I was on a sales floor, but really I worked specifically within a team within that, which was like about 8 people. But then I had my client services rep. The office manager was someone I worked with a lot. There were so many people who were in that 4 to 8 people vicinity that really affected my day-to-day things. So I love that. I love that definition of teams. And when you were talking about broken printers, it's such a great metaphor, partially because at one point I worked at a hockey team, and part of my job on game days, we had these 2 huge industrial-sized printers, and I had to print 300 packets that I would then distribute throughout the arena, and those printers would always break. There were days where I had to sit next to the printer and wait for all of those packets. I don't even know who really looked at those packets. And I would think about this. I would sit there and I'd be like, I can't believe I'm being paid to babysit this printer right now. Why isn't this digital? Who actually needs all of this? And it was taken so seriously, and I felt like I had no ownership over this problem. And so both literally and metaphorically, I really relate to the broken printer problem.
Yes. And I do like how you define the team with the 4 to 8 people, and how those are the people you are close with. Those are the people you form a relationship with. And in your book, Team Habits, you specifically talk about belonging. And I think we've all worked in teams where we felt like really good vibes with the people. And then we've probably also worked in teams where we didn't get along with people. And I think a lot of times we can think, oh, that's my personality and I didn't get along with this type of person, or that person is difficult to work with. And what I like about your book is you kind of talk about these strategies where we can actually make deliberate efforts to foster those relationships, to find those commonalities with the people around us, and how that sets us up for things like asking the question, what's not working here? Because when you ask that to a group that you love, that's easy. When you ask that to someone you already have an issue with, that's almost like an attack. Why do you think it's so important to foster belonging in a team?
So belonging is the bedrock for high performance. So that's one aspect to look at. So if you really want to win as a team, you really do need to know who you're running with, and they need to trust you, and you need to trust them, and you need to feel like your work matters, that it's being appreciated, and they need to feel the same. And fundamentally, it comes down to who's got your back. So when Michelle mentioned those 4 to 8 people that she talked about in her team, she knew at a certain point that they had her back and she had theirs. And that's important because there will inevitably become challenges in work. What you think is going to be easy is going to be hard. What you think is going to be hard is going to be easy. And just the busyness of work, we're going to bump into each other. We're going to not be our best versions of humans, so on and so forth. So if we don't have that high belonging factor, then it's very easy for me to, metaphorically step on Sammy's toe, and then her to take it personal and hold her grudge, right? For like, Eric, Charlie stepped on my toe. I can't believe he did that. He's such a chauvinist, and so on and so forth. And really, I was looking at my phone, right, and stepped on her foot and didn't even realize it. But if Sammy knew me and we had that relationship, she'd be like, hey, dummy, stop stepping on people's toes. And I'd be like, oh, my bad. And then we go on about the rest of the day, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's important on that sort of performance side of things. But again, it's important because I think what we are rediscovering after COVID with AI, and really when you look at what a lot of the macro trends in the workplace, whether it's the Great Resignation or quiet quitting, it's really what we are saying is we want to be better humans with each other. We want to be with people that matter to us, doing things that matter to us. And the more that you make those bonds tight with your teammates, like we've all experienced at that time, like there might be something at work that you really don't care about, but because Michelle cares about it and it's important to her, we're going to show up, not necessarily for work, but for Michelle. Because we know that there's probably going to be some time that it's our turn, but 2, that's just what we do. That's what we do as humans. And again, 4 to 8 people. And I have to keep stressing that because so many people are like, Charlie, that doesn't scale. You can't do this in large organizations. I'm not talking about how you scale that level of attention across a large organization, unless we're talking about how you foster a place where teams can do that. Like an organization is a group of teams, or it's a group of groups, right? As a way of thinking about that. It's important from that perspective. And the funny thing about this is, I had this realization as I was writing the book, early on in the books. I was walking down the bookstore aisles, and I went through like the personal relationship aisle. So dating, marriage, all of those types of things, having kids. And I looked at sort of the questions that were being asked there by book titles. And then I walked down the business section and realized they're the same questions, just in a different context. So if you're ever on the personal relationship aisle, it's how do we not fight as much? How do we have more positive experiences? How do we craft a future that's meaningful for both of us together? How do we decide that this isn't working, and what do I do? Broadly speaking. When you walk down the business section, it's basically the same question. How do we not fight as much at work? How do we get along better at work? How do we do stuff that matters together? How do we move forward together? Those are the same basic questions, just in different context. So what I want to do in Team Habits is really have us make work personal again. Not in a way that we get in all in people's private lives in ways that they don't want to include us, but that, like, let's stop treating each other like cogs and just parts that are fungible and replaceable, and start treating each other like the wonderful, amazing, sometimes very flawed creatures that we are, and see what happens to both our happiness at work, but also the results that happen at work too.
What are some tips that you have, either from a leadership perspective or even the individual's perspective, to help create a sense of belonging in the workplace or within your team?
So I'll talk about from the leadership side first, because while everyone can improve their team and their team habits, leaders have both the responsibility and more power to do so. And so the first thing that I would say to leaders is, aside from by the book, which is cheeky but also true, right? One is make space for the human conversations that need to happen, like that chit chat, that people do, those water cooler conversations, those random jokes and memes that people send. That's actually a critical part of work, right? It's not some distraction. And if you don't make space for that and actually allow for that, your people won't actually bond with each other. 2, what I would say is, within professional bounds, learn who your people are. Like, seriously, what are their kids' names? What are their pets? Where do they like to go? Like, take the time to really give a damn. I think, as much as I appreciate the actual substance of Mark Manson's book, we actually I don't think we need more people not giving a fork, right? I think we need more people really caring about each other and showing that. And leaders, if you take the time to do that and show that that's important, you set a precedent that your team can do that as well. The third thing I would say to leaders is get the hell out of the way. Because your team, if you give them the space to bond and figure out who each other are, actually will. Because again, that's who we are as creatures. That's the type of thing we are. So much of the chapter about belonging in retrospect is like how to make adult friends or how to make friends as adults, right? Because when we think about it, like, no one teaches you how to make friends. Well, most people are not taught how to make friends. You're just around the kids you're at school with, and you learn that some of them have things you like and you like them and others you don't. And you sort of clump up with that and you just sort of learn that. But again, you learn that in a low-stakes environment that plays out over many years. Turns out, work is not like that. For many people, feels very high stakes, and you feel like you got to get it done. And then we take on all of these cultural suggestions that you got to be uber productive and you got to be super persons and things like that. And then all of that stress about being a great performer enters work, and we don't make time to make friends. So much of that chapter is kind of like what you learned in kindergarten, and it sounds simple, but simple is not easy to practice. Like, what are their names? What do they like? How have you actually made time to sit down and figure out who they are? What are their non-work wins? What do they like to do? Like, a lot of those types of questions are things we just need to make space for, and they're not, quote unquote, productive unless you understand productivity as the methods of thriving, in which case it is.
It's so funny that you say that because we literally have an episode called How to Make Friends as an Adult, and it is actually one of our most popular episodes. And I think it's exactly for that reason that you say that we aren't necessarily taught how to do that as an adult, and people want that information. People want to know how to be close with the people around them. And you brought up a great point. It's not just for friendship anymore. Now you're also in a scenario where there's a lot of stuff to get done. And that's also what I love about your book, and I think our listeners will love, is that there's a lot of practical tips on how to organize your work in a team setting, because I think that's different than just organizing your work alone too. Like I think about me and Michelle, and for example, right now we are actually moving from California to South Carolina. So we have a lot of things that we're like a lot of moving parts. We're looking for an apartment. We're getting a pod to move our stuff. We're trying to move our cars. And there's this idea of whose responsibility is each thing. And one thing we really loved about your book is you distinguish between who owns the question and who owns the decision. And this is really helpful for us. So I wondered if you could tell our listeners about it.
Yeah, thanks so much for pulling that out. And also, you all have read Start Finishing, so you know that the cross-country move is a project, right?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
I have told everybody, I was like, I'm moving soon. I cannot add other stuff. It's a huge project.
Mm-hmm.
And we're switching jobs and things like that. So it adds up. So yeah, we definitely
So that's two
know.
projects.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back and talk about Start Finishing at some point because we're making a reference to the 5 projects rule here.
Yes.
So a lot of times when we think about what needs to happen, to Sammy's point, it's like, oh, someone has to make a decision, and a lot of pressure gets put on that person to be like the sole decider and to know all the things, and that's terrifying, right? Especially for a lot of high-stakes things or things that feel like they're high stakes. We can actually open up collaboration by saying not who owns the decision, but who owns the question. When this question pops up, who's the person that's holding that question? And it's their job to help us get an answer to it. And so it might not be the quote-unquote subject matter expert. It just might be the person that's got the time to run around and figure out what the information is and get everybody on board and come and say, hey, y'all, we have 3 different options here. We got to go a different way and can facilitate that, which can be great. Or it can be a person who is uniquely wired to solve that type of thing. Like on my team, there are certain when tech questions pop up. There's Steve on our team. He's sort of the question holder for those. He dives into it. He does that. So the rest of us, including me, because I also have that bug, right? We don't have to think, oh, what tool should we use and what technology? And should I go look at all the features and things? That's not our job. Steve owns those types of questions. And Steve may not decide for different functions what those tools are. But when it comes time for us to make those decisions, he's on board to help us work through those. So it's a really powerful way to actually invite more people to be involved in the decision-making process without necessarily putting the org structure in jeopardy. Because the leaders might have to make the final decision and say it's mine because it's just the way the org works. And I get that, right? But it doesn't mean that overwhelmed manager has to do all of the work of all the things to figure out what's going on. We could say, hey, Sammy, you're like our spreadsheet whiz when it comes to these things. I'm not saying that's true, but it might be, right? I really need your help to sort of own some of these questions about how we can make this better. I'm not the person to do it, but I know it needs to be better. Can you help out? And Sammy might be like, yeah, that's my jam. Let's get it. But she may not be in the position where she feels like deciding unilaterally what other people should do. So it's just a tool to open up collaboration and to give more people a stake in the game. And it turns out that the more that we open up for people to own parts of the problems and parts of the pursuits, the more they feel like they own the entirety of the problem and the pursuits. And so you get more ownership of problems and fewer silos that get bottlenecked by one person.
It's amazing how much just something small like that, like changing the framework of the question, giving someone ownership of the question and knowing who that person is, makes such a difference. Even just mentally. Like, I feel like for our mental health, when we started to reframe some of those questions, it was like, okay, you're going to own the question of who's going to start looking into apartments. And it opens up the conversation instead of having it, sometimes if we're in a bad place and we haven't talked about these things, it's a quick snippy, have you called these people? Have you done this? Oh, I didn't know you were going to do that. And so I really, really enjoyed, honestly, I thought you had so many really great tips in the decision-making chapter. And so I highly recommend even just diving into that for anyone who's in any type of team and looking to reframe how they're having those type of conversations. I also want to talk about the 5 projects rules because it comes back in the team habits, and it's probably the one thing that I took away from Start Finishing that had the biggest impact on how I could start finishing my projects, because I finally realized that I had 30 living in my head. And if you have 30 projects that you're trying to tackle at once, nothing is going to get done. So would you mind unpacking a little bit for our listeners the 5 project rule?
Yeah, I love that. And, you learn after a book's been out, like what the book should have been about and what you should have focused on. I probably could have wrote the book just the 5 projects rule, right? And that was the name of the book. But it was one of the things from Start Finishing. And so the basic idea, or the long nerdy way that only Charlie says it, is no more than 5 active projects per time horizon. So no more than 5 active projects per time horizon. It's easy to understand by starting at the end of that sentence, right? Time horizon. We humans, we're just terrible at estimating how long this thing takes, right? We don't know, like, if this is going to take us 17 hours or whether it's going to take us 4 hours. Like, it's really weird when we put actual time, clock time on things. And yet, we kind of know what a month-sized project feels like. We kind of know what a week-sized project feels like, right? We kind of know what we can do in 2 hours, right? What I call a focus block. A quarter-sized project gets a little bit hairy for folks, right? Because we overestimate how much we're going to get done. So I basically hack that spatial intuitive reasoning and say, hey, if that's the case, when we're thinking about what we're going to do for this month, let's just say, hey, what are the no more than 5 month-sized projects that we can get done? What this also does is let us do a little bit of hand-waving about all the routines and common stuff in the background. Like, no one makes a project of, like, taking their trash out, right? It's not a thing. It's a thing we do in the background. It just happens. Until maybe we're moving and all the routines around that kind of whatnot and all the stuff we have to do pile up so much that it's like, oh, we're outside of our normal bases. We're going to have to actually count, like, organizing as its own project. And so what the 5 projects rule does is really acknowledge that really at those time horizons, most people are not going to do more than 5 projects. And if you don't believe me, actually try it, right? See how many you do. And you'll see that you probably are within 2 to 4 for most times, right? Because the other major insight here, this is not so much for team habits, but it's for Start Finishing, and I'll say it is, life projects count, y'all. Please, please, please. Stop making a full deck of work or economic projects and then wonder why you don't have time for your life. Moving from California to South Carolina is a whole ass project, and there's only one you. There's not a work you and a personal you. There's a you. And so what many people don't think about is part of those 5 projects need to be your personal projects. So I'll take myself. This week, as I said, I had COVID. In Charlie's world, if it takes time, energy, and attention, it's a project. And so it turns out that recovering from COVID is one of my 5 projects of the week. Did I want one of my 5 projects of before launch week to be COVID? Hell to the no. But I had to look at it and say, this is real. Like, I can't pretend that this is not there. So it's just going to eat up a lot of the work, and I got to live with that. But what it's also done is allowed me to have peace with what I can't or won't do, because this is the project. I didn't choose it, but I got to do it. And so that's the 5 projects rule. So listeners, if you heard me talking with Michelle when she's like, well, I'm, moving and then I'm looking for a job, you didn't see me, but I had 2 fingers up because I'm like, oh, those are 2 separate projects there, right? Where this gets useful is when we look at it in a team capacity, is you can also say, okay, turns out there are real constraints at work too. I would say most teammates are not going to be able to push forward more than 3 really substantive projects at any time horizon, right? So more than 3-month-sized projects, more than 3-week-sized projects. And why that's useful is it allows us to have conversations. If I'm doing something and Sammy comes to me and she's like, hey, Charlie, I need you to do this thing. And I'm like, cool. Well, that feels like a month-sized project. I've currently got 3. Let's talk about what's got to lift and shift here, because I know and you know, let's not bullshit it with each other. I'm either going to do all of the now 4 things fairly mediocrely, and we're going to be having a conversation about the slow progress or the mistakes I'm making, or I got to pause one of these 3 that I'm working on and commit to getting that done. What's the play here? And Sammy, if Sammy's the manager, might decide, you know what? Maybe Charlie's not the right person to give that project to, because the 3 things he already has are the things that are the most important. So I need him to get that done. Maybe she'll give it to Michelle. Michelle, you get to be the manager here in a minute. And, we get to have that conversation, but it's just a way for us as a team. Remember, I got to say this as a team, 4 to 8 people. It's me and it's Sammy. I can say, look, I got these 3 major things going on. I really do actually want to do that. But I either have to let go of one of these 3, or we need to come together and accept that this is not going to be at the standard that you and I both might like. What's the play here? What are we going to do? And that's a conversation we can have and figure out, as opposed to either me just being like, Sammy, screw you, I'm not doing it. Or taking it on, and then a month later, Sammy come and be like, hey, Charlie, like, what's going on here? And I never told her I was overloaded at the start.
I love that, Charlie. I think our listeners are going to love this conversation. We just touched the surface of what's in the book, Team Habits. If you want to check out the book, it is in stores. You can buy it today. We love the book. We know that you guys are going to really enjoy it. We know you guys love getting stuff done, but also forming really good relationships. And those are both really important parts of forming a team. Thank you, Charlie, for being here despite having COVID this week. I mean, we really appreciate you coming out. You have given us such good information. I know we can all make big changes with this information that you've given us today.
And Charlie, can you also tell people where they can find you? If there's any other additional information about where they can find the book, that would definitely be super helpful.
Thanks for that. And y'all, I really do appreciate being here today. Thanks for dealing with my slightly less on point flow of a conversation. If you are interested in team habits and making better teams, the best place to go is betterteamhabits.com. That'll direct you directly at the book and with the resources that we have around that. My broader body of work is at productiveflourishing.com. So either way, you're going to end up at Productive Flourishing. But if you're really interested in the team conversations, betterteamhabits.com is the way to go. I'm also active on LinkedIn. And so if that happens to be your jam, follow me there.
Nice, Charlie. And as usual, we'll have all the links in our show notes. You can find everything at buildawealthyspirit.com if there's something that we mentioned that you want to dig deeper into. Sammy and I, again, we really, really enjoyed the book. We're applying so many parts of it to our own little team here, especially when we have major projects coming in our life. And Charlie, it was such a joy to have you on this podcast. We really enjoyed this conversation. You were tip-top shape. We honestly didn't even notice, you you really came and brought your A game, and we really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Takeaways.
So, takeaways from this interview. Sammy, I think this conversation with Charlie was already packed with so many great tips, and we didn't even scratch the surface of the stuff he talks about in Team Habits.
It's so true, Michelle. The book has even more stuff. So if you liked what we talked about today, you definitely should check out the book. But I loved what we got into today. My first takeaway is belonging. I love how Charlie talks about belonging in Team Habits, because belonging is really the bedrock for having a quality team. Because without belonging, there isn't good conversations. Without belonging, it's hard to tell your boss, hey, I can't take on that extra project. I don't have enough space for that. Belonging is just the baseline that really we overlook and we are not intentional about. But if we start from the aspect of, let me be intentional about having a good relationship with the people that I'm working with, then we can more easily work as a team and we can more easily reach our goals and we can have balance.
I agree, Sammy. You know, the teams that I've felt the strongest sense of belonging to, I remember saying, why can't I just work here for 25 years? There was no quiet quitting. There was no looking or applying to jobs in other places. When I had a really strong relationship with the people that I'm working with, it made going to work really enjoyable and really satisfying. Another thing that I really liked that Charlie spoke about was around decision making and about how to distribute ownership over different questions and problems that are coming up. Shifting between who owns the decision to who owns the question is a small but meaningful change. It means that you're not putting all the pressure on one person to figure everything out, but you still have somebody who's taking ownership over the problem, and they're going to help figure out, hey, this is something we need to tackle. How am I going to go about delegating, questioning, and figuring out the different ways I can solve this problem?
Yes, who owns the question is huge. I'm thinking about it in our own life with our own project of us moving. And I'm like, I've been owning the question of transporting the cars, but guess what? I don't have the time. And I'm like, you know what? We got to have a conversation about that and I can give it to you. And I know you can do a great job with it, but I've been carrying that on my brain. And I think realizing that there are questions and that one person needs to be the owner helps it be something that both people have lingering in their brain to worry about.
Exactly. Because then everybody but nobody is owning the problem. And that's going to be a tough situation too. And finally, the 5 project rule, both personally and within your team. Prioritization is very, very important. And we cannot do it all, people. I know, it's a crazy concept. Can't accomplish everything. But if you can limit it down to 5 things, ideally only 3 that are focused on your work, if you honor the things that come up, like Charlie said, he has COVID. And that's not convenient before his book launches. However, he can't fight it, so he may as well have self-compassion. And I thought that was such a great example. Like, you need to prioritize and you need to figure out both, again, as an individual and as a team, what are the things that we're actually focused on so that we can accomplish those 5 things. And then we can tackle the next 5 things. And that is going to help you accomplish more than if you just hold 80 things in your head and everything and nothing is a priority.
I love that, Michelle. The 5 projects rule, I think, is one of my most favorite things that Charlie talks about, but maybe just period. Because the 5 project rules is a game changer. As an individual and as a team, you don't got time for everything. So we got to pick things. We got to pick 5 things. Sometimes I pick 4. Like for my sabbatical, I'm like, you know what? Let's just do 4. We don't want to get too crazy. And it is huge because I can know those 4 things. I can know I'm going to go deep with those 4 things. It just takes a huge burden of stress off. And I know I'm actually going to accomplish the things that I want to accomplish and accomplish them well.
That's exactly right, Sammy. So we totally recommend Team Habits. And if you've made it this far in our podcast, we would love to reward you. We are giving away 5 copies of Team Habits. So send us an email. We would love to send you over a copy. We can do an audiobook. We can do a physical copy. The book does come out today. Mm-hmm. So if you're listening to this when it comes out, help us support Charlie by shooting us an email. Go to buildawealthyspirit.com. You can leave us a comment. However you need to contact us, let us know if you're interested in getting a copy of Team Habits. Either way, we really, really enjoyed the book. You can find information for everything in our show notes and in our newsletter, buildawealthyspirit.com. We will have all the information you need over there.
And most importantly, be sure to join us next time as we put down the rulebook and we rethink the status quo.